Reconciliation between Germany and France was critical. We cannot imagine a Europe had there not been that kind of cooperation between the two dominant economies on continental Europe at that time, the local hegemons, if you will. You don't need a single hegemon, obviously, but you do need to have, if you have two or more countries that are of relatively equal importance, they must be prepared to cooperate. Or, you need to have a set of institutional and cognitive linkages that create a sense of community, a sense of solidarity, a willingness to accept the constraints and the potential sacrifices of commitment because of a larger project at work. In Europe, of course, we had both. We had the local leadership. We also had the sense of solidarity, at least to some extent, a sense of common identity. In other historical examples that I've looked at, sometimes there was one, sometimes there was the other. But it always works best if there are both. The problem in East Asia is that we don't see much of either. On the one side, we don't have coherent leadership. There are obviously two contenders for leadership in the area. Japan, still the second largest economy in the world, with the largest capital markets, financial markets in the region. And then we have China, which is likely to surpass the size of the Japanese economy before the end of this year. Either of these countries could provide leadership, but because of the presence of the other, it's hard to imagine a project moving forward without the cooperation of the two. And we know that these are two countries that really don't trust each other very much. These are countries that find it very difficult to cooperate, to enter into any kind of deep cooperative arrangement. For Japan, the country that has suffered from more or less stagnation for 2 decades now, there is a real concern about being surpassed by the rise of China, what is sometimes called in the literature the China economic threat theory. The Chinese, on the other hand, have a history problem with Japan. Japan, after all, did invade China in the 1930s, and memories are still very acute on that. The two countries clearly are in competition with each other. That doesn't exclude cooperation, and there have been elements of cooperation in Chiang Mai and the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. But the two find it difficult to get along very well. If we look at the example of the Asian Monetary Fund proposal in 1997, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, in 1997, after the breaking of the crisis, the fall of the Thai baht and the contagion that spread throughout the region, what some people call botulism, the Japanese government proposed the creation of a $100 billion fund to provide liquidity assistance. It was quickly dubbed the Asian Monetary Fund, and it was shot down very quickly by the United States and the IMF, and implicitly China, because the US was able to persuade the Chinese government that the Asian Monetary Fund proposal might have consolidated Japanese leadership in financial affairs. And so the Chinese withdrew their support, or withheld their support, and the idea failed, though it remains sort of a goal out there on the distant horizon. If we look at the CMI multilateralization, we see the same kind of jockeying position going on even now. What was at issue in the multilateralization was that they would establish a certain amount of money that could be provided in the event of the balance of payments crisis. They set on a figure of 120 billion. Contributions would be made by various countries, and their voting power in the collective decision to make a loan, their voting power would depend on their contributions. So there was a tricky negotiation that was finally resolved in a very Asian way. Japan felt that for historical reasons, they should make the largest contribution. They should be the country with the most votes. China, of course, felt that it should have at least as many votes as Japan. So what they finally decided was that each would have 36%, but China's contribution would only be 32 and something percent, and the other part would come from Hong Kong. So this way, Japan could say, we're still the largest single national contributor, and China could say, since Hong Kong is part of the sovereignty of China, that China has an equal share. And so they could both go home as winners, which is, that's, what's his name, Fisher at Harvard, would say, getting to yes. That is a perfect example of diplomats finding a way to square a circle. But the point I'm trying to make here is simply that this kind of jockeying position continues. There is a strategic tension between these, and therefore a lack of coherent leadership. At the same time, there is no real sense of common destiny, of common identities, of solidarity in the region. Many things operate to keep them apart. Territorial disputes, ethnic differences, unresolved issues left over from the Cold War. There's a lot of uneasiness in security terms throughout the region. There's also no natural core, no natural inner core, the way there was in Europe, where you had Germany, France, the Benelux, maybe Austria, as a natural core. You don't have anything like that in East Asia. ASEAN by itself is hardly a coherent group. Add the +3 and it's even more difficult. Taiwan is excluded despite its size. Myanmar is included despite its political regime and its poverty. There's clearly no natural group that could provide the starting point. And obviously also, countries have reason to resist making any kind of firm political commitment as long as the two leaders remain at odds. They don't want to have to choose sides. They don't want to have to commit to one side and then possibly find themselves on the losing side in this power game. So, my bottom line then is that financial cooperation up until this point is undeniable in the form of CMI and CMIM, but it's also largely symbolic. It's, in practical terms, its value up until this point is small. And, as I said, the evidence is clear. On one hand, governments have never used the CMI or CMIM. On the other hand, what they have done instead is to self-insure by building up enormous reserves. Not just China and Japan, but others in the region as well. The result is that countries have continued to rely on their own resources, their own reserves, their own exchange rate management, rather than make use of this mutual insurance facility. If I were to stop at that point, it would sound like a pretty pessimistic conclusion. And though I have occasionally, on occasion, been labeled in literature as pessimist, I like to think of myself as an optimist. Of course, it's always difficult to know what's the difference between them. I always like to point out to my students the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. An optimist is somebody like Dr. Pangloss in Candide, Voltaire's Candide, who goes around with a big smile on his face saying, "This is the best of all possible worlds." And the pessimist is the person who nods sadly and says, I'm afraid I agree with you.